So for the second session of our discussion about interpreting and evaluating fiction, let us move on now on the fiction. So what is fiction? So according to Encyclopedia Britannica, fiction is a literature created from the imagination, not presented as fact, though it may be based on a true story or situation. So fiction is a literature that is in the form of prose that describes imaginary people and events. So it is not based on a true story. So the major types of literature in the fiction genre includes the novel, short story, and novella. Fiction word came from the Latin word fictio, that means the act of making, fashioning, or molding. So in a simpler sense, fiction is defined as a prose based on the author's imagination, meaning it includes stories that never happened in real life. So all fiction is a falsehood of sorts because it relates events that never actually happened to people or the characters involved in the story who never existed, at least not in the manner portrayed in the story. So all fiction entails events that never actually happened and the characters usually never existed at all. So let us now move on the types of fiction story. So the first type of fiction story is the short story. So what is a short story? So short story is a short piece of fiction aiming at unity of characterization, theme, and effect. It aims to produce a single narrative effect with the greatest economy of means and utmost emphasis. So unlike novels, a short story is a short piece of fiction that aims to produce a single narrative. And then next, a short story typically takes the form of a brief fictional work, usually written in prose. So short story, as we all know, it was usually written in the form of prose. And then the focus of a short story is much more on the less spectacular aspects of life, on the significance underlying what is apparently trivial. So nowadays, modern short stories often focuses more on the less aspects of life and on what is trivial for the readers or what caught the interest of the readers. Next, the earliest precursors to the short story can be found in the oral storytelling tradition. One good example came from the ancient Mediterranean epics such as the Epic of Gilgamesh and Homer's Iliad. It is believed that the short stories first appeared on the oral storytelling traditions happened many decades or centuries ago. Next, so across the time, genres and writers have influenced the development of the short story. So some of the examples are the anecdotes, fables, fairy tales, parables, and many more. So what makes a good short story? So a short story is a piece of prose fiction which can be read at a single sitting. So a short story is basically shorter than a novel and typically requires just a single sitting for reading. Next, it ought to combine matter-of-fact description with poetic atmosphere. Though it is quite shorter than a novel, it gives us a vivid description of what happens in the entire story. The combination of factual descriptions with the help of figurative language can make the short story more creative and entertaining for the reader. Next, short story ought to present a unified impression of temper, tone, color, and effect. So not only in good story but in every form of literature, it should present a unified impression of temper, tone, color, and effect to its readers. Next, it mostly shows a decisive moment of life. So a good story does not only aim to entertain its audience or the readers, but it also gives them a glimpse about life. Though sometimes in the short story, it is represented from the peculiar characters who never existed or represented through unusual events. Next, there is often little action, hardly any character development, but we get a snapshot of life. So, the form of the short story has a concise narrative, we all know that. And the character is disciplined in action and dramatic events, but it is seldom fully developed because short story focuses on few characters only in a simple plot. So, next. Its plot is not very complex, as what I have said earlier, but it creates unified impression and leaves us with a vivid sensation rather than the number of remembered facts coming from the text. So also, a short story tends to omit a complex plot, but then concerned with a single effect conveyed in few relevant scenes in the story. So also, there is a close connection between the short story and the poem, as there is both a unique union of idea and structure. So just like poetry, short stories has a unique idea and structure. Next, what are the characteristics of a good short story? First, a short story should create a single impression. So as what I have said a while ago, short stories often focuses on a single plot, simplified setting with few characters that aim to create a single impression for its readers. Next, it should be highly economical with every word. All characters, dialogue, and description are designed to develop single pre-designed effects. So every word and story details needs to be concise, including the characters, dialogue, and description. And third, most short stories revolve around a single incident, character, or period of time. So most short stories include single event, single plot, instead of multiple plots, and it has only few characters involved in the story. Next, it should be capable of being read at one sitting. So it can be read at one sitting, presumably for 20 minutes to an hour. Usually, short stories includes 10 to 25 pages that makes the reader to read it in a single sitting. Next, the opening sentence should initiate a pre-designed effect. So most of the time, the short stories has an open or abrupt beginning in which it captures the reader's interest and has a surprise ending in which it gives a single impression for the reader. Next, a short story. In the short story, once the climax was reached, the story should end with minimal resolution. Always be reminded that short story has a simple plot that develop rapidly. Next, characters should only be developed to the extent required by the story. So, the main characters involved should be developed rapidly, as well as depending on what the story calls for them. So, in medias res, short stories usually take place in a single setting and begin in medias res, which means into the middle of things in Latin. So, in general, short stories begin and end abruptly rather. They involve just one plot line and limited in word length. There is little opportunity for further developments in the setting and in the characters itself. Next, limited number of characters. So it is due to the limitations of the genre. Short stories typically focus on just one or a couple of characters. So since the short stories cover brief periods of time, a single character may not be fully developed. So here are some of the example of short stories. So if you have time, take a look of this example of a short story that may caught your interest. Here are the two examples. One is the Canterbury Tales that was written by Geoffrey Chaucer, and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. So let us now move on in organizing patterns for your short story. First, the plot. Take a plot and fit characters to it. So in writing a short story, think of a plot that is not too simple or too complicated for you to write it and for the reader to absorb. Next is the character. Take a character and choose incidents to develop it. So next, fit your characters in your plot and choose numerous scenes that will assist your characters to somehow develop. Next is the atmosphere. Take an atmosphere and get actions and characters to develop it. So it is possible if you take an atmosphere in your story that provides little actions in the plot, but then you should have an idea of what your story will look like. So it is important that you take an idea and use characters and actions to develop your short story. So let's now move on what are the types of short story. First is the anecdote. Anecdote, it is a short account of something interesting and amusing, which usually tells a story about a real person and or incident. So anecdote is a short account about something or someone. It is used to illustrate or support a point, maybe in an essay, a chapter of a book, or an article. So they are very short in length, but mostly it has no specific limits, and it is known for its interesting and amusing nature. So an example is Ralph Waldo Emerson's anecdote. Next type is the drabble. It is defined as an exceptionally short piece of fiction, usually of exactly 100 words, not including the title. So its purpose is to test an author's skills at expressing himself or herself meaningfully and interestingly in a very confined space. So drabble was known to its nature of brevity. It is a very short piece of fiction containing only 100 words, excluding its title. So it is a challenge for the author to express himself or himself meaningfully, creatively, and interestingly in a very confined space. So one good example is the literary work entitled As Light as a Feather. Next is fable. I know that we are very much aware of what fable is. It is a story featuring anthropomorphic creatures that aims to tell a story with a moral. So it is a story involving creatures that aims to tell a story to its readers. So it can be through the character of an animal, plants, inanimate objects, or forces of nature. So oftentimes the moral is explicitly told at the end of the story. So one good example is The Ant and the Grasshopper. Next type of a short story is the faghoot. It is an interesting short story type, also known as a story pun or a poetic story joke. It is a humorous piece ending in an atrocious pun. So faghoot, also known as story pun or a poetic story joke. So it has a humorous nature because it ends with a pun or a joke. So it can be very short or long as it can illustrate is the context of the piece that aims to end in a pun or in a joke. So one good example is the work entitled The Back of the Draw. Next is the flash fiction. It is an extremely short piece of literature that has no widely accepted length, but it has a debated cutoff of between 300 to 1,000 words. So a flash fiction is a short fictional literature that usually has only 300 to 1,000 words. So the writer primarily focuses on the narrative's movement. It challenges the author to reveal something to its reader that they did not know before. So in here, every word and every sentence matters because it can greatly affect the story. So one good example is The One Last Night at the Carnival Before the Stars Go Out. Next type of a short story is the frame story. It is also known as a frame tale or a nested narrative. in which it is a literary technique of placing a story within a story for the purpose of introducing or setting the stage for a main narrative or a series of short stories. So a frame story can be used as a literary technique in introducing or setting the stage for the main character or for the main story. It is just like putting a story within a story. So one good example is the flashback within a larger piece or a quest within a larger game environment. Next is the mini saga. It is a short story told in exactly 50 words. It is a test in brevity about saying a lot with a little. So one good example is the work Never Again. So in here, the author was challenged to tell a story with brevity. It should contain only 50 words, excluding its title. Thus, the title can reach up to 15 words, but not more than 15 words. So the content should have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Next is the story sequence, also called as a short story cycle or a composite novel. So it is a group of short stories that work together to form a longer piece while still functioning as complete short stories on their own. So they are not novel in general, but it is a collection of short stories that were arranged in chronological order that aims to tell small stories to a one larger story. So one good example is Isaac Asimov's Robot. Next is the sketch story, a shorter than average piece containing little or no plot at all. It can be merely a description of a character or a location. So a sketch story, also known as a literary sketch, and generally shorter than a short story. So it contains very little, or oftentimes it has no plot at all. So a sketch story is mainly descriptive only. So it can be about places or travel or about a specific character. One good example is the work Regrets. So last type of short story is the vignette. It is a short impressionistic piece that focuses on a single scene, character, idea, setting, or object. There is a little emphasis on adhering to conventional theatrical or literary structure or the story development. It is a brief impressionistic piece. Either it can be an illustration, a descriptive passage, a short essay that focuses on a single idea, character, setting, mood, or object. So it can be considered as a stand-alone piece or maybe part of a larger story or a larger work. So one good example is E.B. White's Railroads. So now, let me give you a brief history of short fiction or the short story. So always, we all know that most of literature that we have today came from the oral cultures and oral tradition. So one good example is the Native American creation myths and the trickster tales that came from the ancient world, which mostly came from the Greece, Rome, and Asia. So one notable literature was dated from 4000 BC, in which an Egyptian papyrus containing how the sons of Cheops, or an Egyptian pharaoh, entertained their father with a narrative. Next is the emergence of the Christian Bible. We all know that the Christian Bible was divided into two, in which first, the Old Testament, that we know the stories such as those of Jonah, Ruth, Job, Samson, Daniel, etc. So for the New Testament, in here, Christ spoke in parables. It is when Jesus talks or shares the word of God to the people, and also to his disciples. And then the other literature the other form of literature came such as tales. So tales were written for both pleasure and moral instruction. So the author of tales emerged, and it was primarily written for the reader's pleasure and for teaching morals to its readers. So one good example is the work of Petronius, which is entitled Satyricon. So during the Middle Ages, the fables of Aesop became eminent, including his epics. There are also the emergence of the medieval romance and heroic tale episodes, low-life comic tales, and the verse narratives. So about in 1250, 200 tales were collected in the Gesta Romanorum in England. While in the mid-14th century, Boccaccio was able to create or collected 100 tales in his work The Decameron, which is in the form of a prose. And then after, Chaucer wrote his collection The Canterbury Tales. It is one of the most known verse of all time, The Canterbury Tales. Next, during the Renaissance period, the Boccaccian tradition in writing was adopted by the writers from England, France, and Spain. During the 16th and 17th centuries, the picaresque novel arises. So in this period, the novels begins to develop, as well as the informal essays and sketches. One good example is the Cervantes Don Quixote. So during the 18th century, which is the period of neoclassicism, the novel begins to flourish. So the character sketches, satires, Gothic tales, aside from the novels, the character sketches, satires, Gothic tales, rogue stories, adventure stories also became prominent in this period. So it is the rise of informal essay and sketches. So in periodicals, as what I have said earlier, we often see sketches, satires, Gothic tales, and the like. So in England, there are famous authors that have been renowned worldwide, and one of them is Joseph Addison and Richard Steele. While in America, Benjamin Franklin was known, as well as Denis Diderot in France. And then the other authors, the other literature came from Voltaire and the Sage. So in this period, the main topic in literature is about tradition and human reason. Next, during the early and the middle 19th century, which is the period of Romanticism, there are famous authors, including the Germans, who entails Goethe, Tieck, Hoffmann, Kleist, and the Brothers Grimm. While in England, we have Sir Walter Scott, and while in the American writers of short stories includes Washington Irving, Hawthorne, and Edgar Allan Poe. And then others includes Merimee and Balzac, Gaucher, and Musset. So in here, in this period, the main topic or the value presented in literature are about the originality and imagination. So these writers of short stories treated short stories as an art form. There was an increased number of literature exploring psychology and one's eccentric behavior. So one example is the horror stories and the criminal stories. So with these writers, the short story as a distinct genre came into being. So started from tales, it became stories. Short stories begins to have a place in literature. So it is, as what I have said, it is originally called tales, that they were closer to prose romance than the novel. So some of the author Poe, Gogol, and Hawthorne were the greatest and most influential writers of short fiction during the period of Romanticism. So, tales soon become stories. For example, here are some of the examples, including Melville's Bartleby, and in which it is more realistic and the narrator is not a psychological abstraction, as is Goodman, Brown, or Hawthorne, and the Montresor or Poe. So the short story begins to have a definition, as what I have said earlier, due in a large part of Edgar Allan Poe. That became something like this. It is an original prose work in which every word chosen in the structure of the plot and every detail of description and characterization contributed to a unified impression. So Poe was able to define short fiction. So in the later 19th century and early 20th century, which is the period of realism and naturalism, so from Romanticism, realism paved its way after the mid-19th century. So characters in a novel, including in short stories, were recognizable social masks and reflect an everyday reality. So short stories and novels reflects the societal issues and the reality happened in the society. So we have the Russian realistic writers, including Chekhov and Leo Tolstoy, while we have American local color writers such as Chopin and Jewett, and we have Ambrose Bierce, who combines romanticism, realism, and modernism in his literature. Moreover, at the end of the 19th century, O. Henry introduced the surprise ending story. So we have the American authors, American realists rather, that includes Cather, Crane, and Henry James. So there were also European authors such as Guy de Maupassant and Anton Chekhov, who became the most influential writers of short fiction during this period. So while in the early 20th century, we have modern writers such as Conrad, Joyce, Kafka, Lawrence, and Mansfield. So for the early to mid 20th century, which is the period of modernism, writing became more experimental and writers were soon called modernist writers. So modernist writers such as Faulkner, Hemingway, Porter, and Wright. So these are some of the writers who became the modernist writers during this period. So during this period, writing became more experimental. So during the mid to later 20th century and the 21st century, which is the period of postmodernism and contemporary, definitions are still being debated. So meaning definitions are continually being debated because more writers influence others and a lot of new authors emerged. So various genres and forms of literature became eminent across the time. So let's now move on to the next type of fiction, which is novel. A while ago we discussed about novels. Let's now talk about novel. So what is novel? So it is an extensive fictional prose narrative. It is like a universe with very wide space wherein writers can create and add billions of imaginations in it. It can be lengthy as long as possible, but it still has limits. A very long story can also be called novel if it has numerous settings, characters, and events. So a good novel must have balanced length of each element. So another type of fiction is the novel, in which considered as an extensive fictional prose narrative. So it can be compared to a new universe with a very wide space that writers can create billions of imaginations in writing. So it can be lengthy, but it still has limits. Yeah, it contains varied plots or different plot structures and series of events, unlike the short stories that deals with single plot and few characters. So there are novels which have more than 1,000 pages, but they can be considered as good reads, namely War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy and The Broken Drum by David Manlio. So novel has numerous settings, characters, and events. So there are also novels that can be that can reach more than 1,000 pages, but then can be considered as a good read. And those are some of the examples are the works of Leo Tolstoy and David Manlio. So let's now move on the types of novel. So the first type is the episodic novel. So episodic novel is defined as a novel of different events yet woven together. Usually it is only one character which encounters different circumstances in different places. So this type of novel includes varied events but connected to each other. So usually it has only one character. The adventures of the character are different yet were happened in one life of a character which is woven together. That is what we call the episodic novel series of the character's adventures or journey. Next is the epistolary. The epistolary novel has its root word epistle, which means letter. So epistolary uses letters to tell a story. So usually a writer writes a letter to a real or abstract character. So in short, based from its root word epistle, that means letter, this type of novel uses letters to tell the story. And the writer usually writes a letter for either a real, specific, or abstract character. So one good example is the work of Alice Walker entitled The Color Purple. Next type of novel is the historical novel. So came from its name, it recreates the past. The time and the characters are based from the past. So as a story, as if it happened in this history. So this type of novel focuses from the events happened in the past. So the story brings back the past, including the characters and the time frame used in the entire story. So next type is the political novel. So it involves ordering of men in society or politics. Sometimes it is revealed through satires like Gulliver's Travel. Usually, it is revealed through the realistic action stories like Divergent. So political novel primarily focuses on politics or government, as what have been depicted in its name. It entails events about the reality on men in society, politics of government. One good example is the work of George Orwell's 1984. Next is the psychological novel. So it is more interested in what goes in the character's mind. So it recounts the inner experience of the character. So sometimes it is partnered with the story of a physically challenged character. So one good example is the Mystery Case of Benjamin Buttons. So this type of novel explores the inner experience, thoughts, and reasons of the characters depicted in the story. So in simpler sense, the writer explores what goes in the character's mind. So we are down in the last type of novel, which is the epic novel. It recounts adventures of heroic protagonists whose actions are of historical or legendary significance. The deeds of the heroic characters are so important that they interest the supernatural forces. One good example is Hercules from Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. So since it is in the form of epic, It involves heroic protagonist adventures whose actions are considered as historical and legendary. So the deeds of the character greatly interest or captures the supernatural forces that makes it more entertaining and creatively done in a story. So for our next topic on our next discussion or our last discussion, we will tackle about the elements of fiction. So we are done discussing the first, what is literary analysis. Next, what are the critical approaches in critiquing a literature, and we are also done in discussing the fiction, including its major types such as short story and novels. Now, for our last discussion, we will tackle about the elements of fiction. So, see you next session. Thank you for listening.